Hey everybody, I hope you can hear me well. If this is your first time hearing a kind of flipped classroom video, then that's great. This is kind of what it worked like for the classes that were doing the flipped classroom earlier. Now, let's go ahead and get started here with Notes D. I have 15 minutes on this video, so I'm going to try to get everything in less, or then I'll make a part 2 if necessary. When it comes towards ending the war, what you really want to understand about the Civil War is that after the Battle of Gettysburg, we know that the war was coming to a close, and it was obvious that the South was losing, and that they were going to finally feel the full weight of the Union here as time went on, and Europe did not come into the war to help them. So to finish this war, Lincoln hired Ulysses S. Grant at the very end of the war in order to really bring this to the shortest conclusion as possible. And the thing about Grant that stood out to Lincoln was that he was always willing to fight. He was someone who was always aggressive and didn't win every battle that he was a part of, but that he was a fighter, and Lincoln liked that about him. Now, Lincoln asked Grant to put together a plan in order to defeat the South, and Grant came up with this plan. The first phase of his plan was to hire a man named William Tecumseh Sherman, and Sherman's job was to start about in Tennessee and march all the way through Georgia and down to the port city of Savannah. And on his way down, he was going to burn and destroy everything in that state, particularly the city of Atlanta, but all of the farmland, the barns, the houses, and everything else along his way, basically trying to eliminate the Southerners' capabilities to resist. Up in the Shenandoah Valley, Grant then hired a man named Franz Sigel, who was supposed to then burn the valley as well, and his job was to kind of keep this from supplying the Confederate Army. From the east, he hired a third general to come in and try to surround Robert E. Lee, and then to take Robert E. Lee on himself, Grant was going to take the bulk of the Union Army and march straight down Virginia towards Richmond, where he was going to try to take Lee head on. So, where we're going to start is actually with Grant here in the north. Then we'll move to Sigel and kind of his story with the Shenandoah Valley, and then we'll finish up with Sherman and what happens to him as the war goes on. So, we'll start with Grant. Now, as Grant was moving down the south and headed towards Richmond, he was about to take on Lee's forces, which are entrenched here, and the defense was very effective. So Grant, instead of trying to take Richmond head on, he decided that he was going to take a roundabout route and head down to Petersburg instead. He believed that if he took Petersburg, because it was a major supply city, he would be able to maybe cut off Richmond and keep that from getting the supplies it needed to continue on. So Grant headed down towards Petersburg, but when he got there, he started to see this. All right, he started to see trenches in the ground. They were built up all over the city with these kind of wood-sustained walls. He also saw all the trees in the surrounding area had been cut down, and it basically looked like a barren wasteland for him and for his troops. And the Confederates, what their plan was to kind of hide down in these trenches and sit and wait for the Union to try and attack. And if you can imagine, if you're Grant and you're looking ahead at something like this, and your job is to try to get into Petersburg, but you have to run across a terrain like this, it is a very risky thing to do because you don't have any cover. You also can't quite see where the enemy is. And so for Grant to kind of go right at this would be very, very risky for him and the troops. So what happens here at Petersburg is that instead of a all-out offensive battle like we were used to seeing at Antietam or Gettysburg, where both sides kind of clashed in the middle of a battlefield and you had this huge battle happening, Petersburg actually ended up being kind of a stalemate, and both sides settled in for what we call a siege. Now, a siege in traditional warfare is where one side kind of surrounds a city and doesn't allow anyone to get in and doesn't allow anyone to get out. And the idea is that you can basically starve your enemy out until they surrender. But at Petersburg, what Grant did was that he sat there and waited, and the person who was not happy about this was Lincoln. Lincoln wanted this battle to end as quickly as possible, But Grant really tried to urge him and say, look, there is no way to get through this because of the situation that we see. So what Grant had to stop and do, folks, was he had to use his long-range artillery fire to try to get at the soldiers at Petersburg. So you can see here in the picture, you can see a mortar that can shoot a shell over a long period of distance, but you also started to see some advancements in warfare like this long-range cannon that began to really change what warfare liked. And what Petersburg really was, folks, was a preview of what war is going to look like from here on out. Because of the advancements in weaponry and the ability to fire weaponry at far distances, a lot of war from this point on is going to be much more defensive rather than offensive, because for them to be offensive, it would require a lot of bloodshed and a lot of unnecessary carnage. So what we see at Petersburg, we will see again in battles like World War I that you can see here. These pictures, will look very familiar to what Petersburg did, but these are actually from World War I. And you can see that this type of trench warfare that makes it very slow is going to be really the future of how things are fought. And so when we talk about the length of battles, Antietam, was 1 day. Gettysburg was 3 days. But Petersburg, folks, was 10 months. So it was a lot longer. It took a lot of patience. And if you're Grant and you can't go through the army, you can't go above because planes don't exist, what he decides to do is go under. And Grant and his soldiers decided in the summer of 1864 to build a tunnel underneath the Confederate line to try to get around or try to get through this blockade. And so they built this tunnel. Took them a little over a month, and at the end they packed it with a whole bunch of dynamite, and then on July 30th of 1864, boom. And the Union Army, once this kind of shot went off, they rushed at the Confederate forces and actually fell into this crater that was created and were captured by the Confederates. Neither side really had ever seen the impact of dynamite like this before, and so they were unsure exactly what it would do. And it showed the desperation of the Union forces trying to really get at the Confederacy when they could have just waited them out. But they had the pressure of trying to end this war as quickly as possible. Now, here's what that crater looks like today. You can kind of see it's a very large area. And you can see all the trees that have grown back since they would have cut them down on that very day. But it's obvious that the Union knows this war is going to be over, and yet they're willing to try to do anything to really end it quickly. So while Petersburg is going on, remember Petersburg is a 10-month battle. It's a long time. In the other parts of the war, we have the second phase of Grant's plan, which was to burn the valley. Now remember, here's Grant. And here's the guy, Franz Sigel, that he had asked to initially burn the Shenandoah Valley. Unfortunately, Sigel had been defeated at several battles, and Grant decided to replace him with this man on the right, Philip Sheridan. Now, that's a name you want to remember, so if you want to go ahead and circle that name or highlight that in your notes, I would suggest it. But Philip Sheridan was much more successful than what Franz Sigel was able to do. And his job, remember, was to come into the valley and destroy everything. And he did this very, very well. In fact, there are still barns in our area here in Rockingham County where you can see the burn marks from the impact that Sheridan had on the valley. He used what we call a scorched earth tactic, which was really designed to try to bring the civilian population to their knees and keep Lee's army from getting all of the crops and the harvest of the Shenandoah Valley. So this is ultimate destruction, folks. This is the Union stepping in and really saying, look, we're going to take away your ability to resist. So that's phase 2, Sheridan burning the valley. All right? Now, as this is going on in the background, again, there's a lot going on in 1864. The other problem that Lincoln has is that he has to win a re-election. And, it wasn't easy in 1864. There was a lack of progress on the war front. There were failures like the crater and all the casualties that were starting to pile up for Lincoln had really turned a lot of the public opinion against him and his administration. And Lincoln really thought for a little bit that he might lose this presidential election, that he might not be able to see the country through the war that had started from his very first term. And, you know, what we were doing here in 1864, no nation had ever done before, folks. No one had ever had a national election while the country was in the middle of a civil war. And a lot of people in Lincoln's own party really questioned if he was able to do this job. And Lincoln had to battle through all of this while commanding the army. And to make matters even worse, the guy that Lincoln was running against was none other than his old nemesis, George McClellan. I hope you remember McClellan as the war general that Lincoln fired twice, because these two men did not like each other, and McClellan ran against Lincoln as a Democrat. But fortunately for Lincoln, McClellan was largely unorganized and uncoordinated. When it came down to actually voting, most people felt much more comfortable voting in someone that they recognized. And when we look at the electoral map in 1864, we can really see that Lincoln dominates both, well, not quite the popular vote, but dominates the electoral votes only in the North. And this one, the Confederate States did not vote because they would not have considered themselves a part of the Union. So, you know, so Lincoln wins re-election. He's now going to be able to see through the end of the war, although not much longer after that. Unfortunately, Lincoln will be won't be around for too much longer. And that means then the final part of Grant's plan now comes into effect. And that is William Tecumseh Sherman. That's another name you want to highlight here. Because if you remember what Sherman was supposed to do, folks, was his job was to start in Tennessee and march all the way down to the coastline of Georgia and destroy everything in his way. And Sherman did a really nice job of this. In fact, Sherman was an old friend of a friend of Grant's back from when they were relatively nobodies, and they both had their problems. I mean, Grant, we talked about some of his problems with alcoholism, but Sherman had some own mental disabilities that he had to deal with. And, you know, you look at this quote about how these men felt about each other. I love this at the bottom. When asked about their relationship, Sherman said this. He said, "Grant stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. And now we stand by each other always." So Grant trusted Sherman to do his job, and do his job he did. Sherman flanked his way all the way down through Georgia and stopped at the city of Atlanta to destroy what they consider to be one of their largest manufacturing centers in the South. And if Atlanta would be destroyed, they felt like this would really keep the South from being able to resist the war in the following year. And so Sherman walked into Atlanta. You can see some pictures of it here. And he leveled this city, ladies and gentlemen. He absolutely brought it to its knees. He took the railroad ties and bent those up so that the railroad couldn't be used anymore, and just inflicted an unbelievable amount of damage in Georgia in particular. And by the time it was all done, Sherman had marched from Tennessee to Atlanta. And then you can see here, after he was done in Atlanta, he made his way out to Savannah and then up through South Carolina to Columbia. By the time this was all done, ladies and gentlemen, Sherman had caused about $100 million worth of damage. If we put that in today's terms, that would be upwards in the billions of dollars. And the problem with this is, folks, and a lot of people felt like in the South that this was too much, because once this war is over, remember, as soon as Robert E. Lee signs that document to surrender, the South is part of America again. So the more we destroy, the more we have to rebuild. And a lot of Southerners felt like this was part of the Northerners' plan, because if all of the industry in the South is gone, who would the South have to rely on to rebuild it, other than the northern factories and industries that were located there? So there's a lot of different motives for this, but what we want to get out of this is that Sherman's march caused a lot of resentment in the South, and destroyed tons of farmland, tons of personal property, and a lot of their major cities.